Well, thank you for the invitation and the introduction. Now, this is going to be a quite challenging and funny talk to me because I was explicitly asked not to present all of this, all of the work that we're doing every day, all of the things that you can see at the posters that my students show here on the conference. But I was explicitly asked to talk about sort of my journey in science and international collaboration and what would be my take-home messages. So this is obviously a very personal view because it's based on my story, but I hope some of you can relate to it and maybe there is the one or the other good idea that you get from it. Because actually my story doesn't start here. Machine learning, big data, predictions. My story is starting here, which is actually looking through the microscope at hundreds and thousands of brain sections, mapping cortical areas. Now, this was quite successful, but it's completely unrelated to what I'm doing now. So this would actually be my first take-home message, and this is something I've been in discussion with potential PhD and master students for a long time, and over again. How much does the topic of your master's thesis, how much does the topic of your PhD thesis predefine a certain path in your career? Well, I guess from my own example, I can say none at all. What is important is that you learn good scientific practices and that you keep open-minded, and it's actually quite likely for those of you that are at the PhD master student level that whatever you end up doing in 20, 30 years will have nothing to do with what you're doing right now, neither in terms of the methods nor in terms of the topics. Well, quite early in my PhD, actually it was in the second year, I was quite lucky that I was sent to my very first OHBM meeting. So I was presenting preliminary data on cytoarchitectonic mapping, and what happened there is that I met these two gentlemen, Gary Egan and John Watson, and they actually invited me to come to the Fleury Institute to Australia. I spent a couple of weeks there, and we started to collaborate. And before I could even publish the first results from my own PhD work, I already had this paper together with Gary and John. Now, why I'm bringing this up? I think what was critical there is that when I met with them, first at my poster and then at their poster, the way I approached it is, let's say, quite different from what I see at the moment from many students that come up to our posters. And that is, you shouldn't really try to sell things. You shouldn't really try to immediately get something out of it, but to keep this baseline scientific curiosity. Oh, that's an interesting stuff. We should do something together there. I've certainly been lucky. I mean, all of this is always really taken with a big survivor bias, because if it would not have worked out, I would not be standing here, right? But I can really see from my own experience and people that I know, that I see, is that when you engage in collaborations in a curious and open manner, less as a way to, let's say, improve your standing, to sell your tools, to get a quick paper out. I mean, it's a long-run game here. So you will meet people over and over again, years and years. And so I think ultimately it does pay off. This is another, I think, milestone from my own work. And that kind of interesting resonates with Russ' talk. So the SPM Anatomy Toolbox, once I created it, it was in 2004, I really was just looking for something to mix cytoarchitectonic analysis with fMRI for my own work. And then I just, without really knowing what I do, and I certainly with horrendous programming skills, I mean, the code is open, look at it. It is as horrendous as you can program something like this. I just made it public. And I'm not sure if I would do it nowadays, because now sort of you're wiser, you're more careful. As a student, I was like, oh, maybe other people wanted to use it as well. Boom, other people used it. So it's been cited like 2,500 times now, and it's been used a lot. Now, what's the take-home message from that? There's actually two separate ones. One is, don't worry too much about how good you are in terms of coding, whether you are ready for it or not. It actually has never hurt me that I'm such a horrendous programmer, at least I was at that time. I had people comment on, well, this is not well done, and maybe you want to do this, but there was never any harm or pushback from that. The other side is, I think software, making software available, is a double-edged sword. Why am I saying that? I was just all in favor to it. Why am I now saying it's a double-edged sword? Well, it can be fantastic for your visibility. I mean, I was giving like 50 invited talks in the next 2 or 3 years. So it really, really helps in that respect. But it also comes at a high price. I stopped counting how many emails I got with stupid questions, with things that are explicitly in the manual, with things that are explicitly on the website. How many questions I got about things that are physically impossible to do. You need to have the commitment to deal with every single one of them. And it takes a lot of time. But that's the only way you can build your reputation for such a project. And so in the end, I'm glad I did it. And now we're actually, a little plug here, we have a poster tomorrow showing a new version that's now about 15 years of programming experience later. So it's now actually fast and reliable and nice. Yeah, I think I just felt at some point I have to catch up with reality. So one of the things that this work allowed me to do is to join Carl Zillis and Katrin Ammons at the ICBM meeting, and then got introduced to Peter Fox. And I think quite a few of you know that we then started to work together on meta-analysis, and for many years worked on the Brainmap project. Now, again, this is not just a description of what I did, but also what I learned from it. The interesting thing is, I'm quite sure it's the same in China as in Germany, international experience. You have to be abroad to be a PI. Everybody agrees? Somebody who's never been abroad really can't be a PI nowadays. I've never been. So what did I do? Collaborate. So I've been visiting Peter in San Antonio about 2 times a year for 5, 6 years. We had big grants together. We wrote a lot of software. We wrote a lot of papers. And I think this really comes down to the fact that I think international mobility is good. But there's also kind of a reality. People are having kids. People are having partners that have non-academic jobs. People have parents they need to take care of. And don't worry. You can match these requirements, these commitments, by many ways. And I think this is something that I really want to give to everybody. Think about the ends. What do you want to show to a committee? You want to show to a committee, the hiring committee, for example, that you are internationally experienced, that you have an open world view, that you are globally connected. And of course, staying in the US for a couple of years is one way to do it, but it's not the only way. Well, and then also at the ICBM meeting, another person that I met there was Alan Evans, and he actually dragged me along to China for the first time. I don't know if you remember that. Long before we really started working, I was with you at the Mikai meeting, and not much happened. So we met each other, we had a nice dinner, and that's it. And then it really was a couple of years later, then at the OHBM meeting here in Beijing, where I again met with Tianzi and Ling Zhong and a lot of students. And then we actually started to collaborate more and collaborate a lot more. And I said, I've never been abroad in my life. Now I'm also visiting professor in China. What's the message here? It comes back to what I said earlier. It's a long-run, multi-shot game. Yeah? Be open-minded, be helpful and productive, and just wait for things to come. When I visited Beijing in 2010, it was nice, but that's it. 2 years later, all of a sudden, we started a good collaboration. It certainly would not have been the case if I, in 2010, really tried to squeeze 1 or 2 papers out of it or grab something and so on. So then, obviously, we did do a lot of work together, and that's just sort of a summary of this, which is actually quite nice, because what that is a merger between the Brainmap Center and also the Research Imaging Center in San Antonio. So a lot of the meta-analysis work I was doing with Peter Fox also integrated nicely with the Brainmap. And I think this is the kind of international connection experience that is more important than just staying abroad for a couple of years. So over the years, there are quite a few international collaborations. It's just highlighting some of the more dominant ones. And one thing you will always note there is that when you look at my CV, if you go to PubMed, I trend to have many papers with my collaborators. So it's not the 1-2 shot things. We just work on a project together and that's it. But usually with basically all of the people mentioned here, we're working together 5-10 years with like 10-20 papers over the years, co-supervising students, helping each other. And I think that's actually what's great about science. It really gives it a sort of more integrated family life-like approach that I think is also for you personally the much more interesting, the much more nice way of working. Because at some point you start to know your collaborators well, you know their personalities, you know their differences, and you also start to know, that's sort of the last bit I definitely also want to mention in that context, you also start to notice more and more what are, let's say, the cultural, institutional specialities across the world. One very interesting point that I really started to note when I was working more with the people at the Brainmap Center is that having worked so much with the US previously, I was very much adopting to the American way of just everybody being first name and all being sort of very easygoing and stuff. And I actually noted then when I worked more with Chinese colleagues that actually the way I was raised and culturalized in Germany works way better with the Chinese culture than the American way I kind of adapted to when I was working a lot with the US. And I can tell you, when you just see the names here, there's the US, there's people in Asia, like in China and Singapore, also working with people in Tehran. To me, that's a great adventure in life, because you actually go to places like Beijing, like Tehran, and you live there for a week or two. So you're not just a tourist, but you actually integrate into a work environment. And this is not only a lot of fun, but it's also a steep learning curve, I can tell you. And I can really recommend everybody to have the open mind. For example, not to force everything onto the US system in terms of assistant, associate, full professor, and so on, because systems are different. So be open-minded when you're internationally, and I think recognize that places are different and that there is no one particular way of doing things. So what are my take-home messages here? Cooperation is a great approach to building a good visibility. And writing software can go a very long way in that respect. In fact, probably 3/4 of all collaborations I had started from people emailing me about a particular software problem. But it needs the commitment. So I was saying, like say, 80% of my collaborations start from emails about software, but the positive predictive value is very low because there's hundreds of emails about software, and only a very little amount of them then ends in collaborations. But if you don't have the commitment to deal with these hundreds, you're not going to find the few that in the end then leads to a long and nice collaboration. Probably my key take-home message. Think of science as a multi-shot interactive game. If you're not being a nice person, if you're being an asshole, to put it clean, people will remember, and you will meet these people again. End of story. And when you meet next time, they're not going to work with you again. And also, it's not a zero-sum game. I think that's something that is really important to recognize, in particular when you work with people that are on a similar topic. For example, now with people that work with machine learning, brain pastillation, and so on, you could argue, well, aren't we in some way competitors? Yeah, we are. But it's not a zero-sum game. We also can work together and actually together have a nice success and a lot of fun on the way. and finally embrace the idiosyncrasies of the scientific systems. And the last thing I want to close with is actually a little bit of a shameless advertisement, not for me, but actually for these two guys over there, because I have two Chinese Scholarship Council students that are at the moment working in my lab. And Ji Chen is presenting also here really great work on modeling schizophrenia psychopathology and subtype classification. Xiaojin Liu is, I think, is presenting a multimodal map on the human stratum going from brain mapping all the way to clinical applications. And I've had extremely good experiences with Chinese Scholarship Council students. So if you are a master student or if you're supervising a master student, watch out for our calls this fall. Thanks a lot.
Okay, many thanks to Simon